Hey everyone, and welcome. So today we're diving into this incredible story about a huge intellectual battle that completely changed an entire field of science. It's a fascinating story about how we find meaning in the past, and it all kicked off with a revolution sparked by one single game-changing book. And really, it all comes down to one big question. When an archaeologist uncovers, say, a piece of pottery, or a stone tool, or even a human burial, what are they really looking at? Is it just a passive object, a simple record of what someone did? Or is it something more? This very question, right here, is the beating heart of archaeology's great theory war. Okay, so to get why this was such a big deal, we first need to understand the world it was rebelling against. We've got to go back in time to the 1960s and 70s. This was an era when archaeology was on a serious mission to become a hard science, just like physics or biology. So back then, the big idea on the block was called New Archaeology, or, if you want to get technical, Processualism. The whole point was to stop just, describing dusty artifacts and start explaining them. These folks wanted to find the grand, universal processes, the systems that shaped human societies, kind of like a physicist uncovers the laws of gravity. And look, the ambition here was massive. Their goal was to treat culture as an extrasomatic means of adaptation, which is really just a fancy way of saying culture is humanity's big toolkit for surviving in different environments. The focus was all on the big picture. How did populations adapt? How did they get food? How did their societies function as systems? And things like the human mind, beliefs, symbolism, well, those were kind of pushed to the side, seen as secondary, or maybe even impossible to know. But, and there's always a but, right? This is where you start to see the cracks forming. For a whole new generation of young scholars, this super scientific approach, as powerful as it was, felt like it was missing something absolutely essential. So the critics started saying, hang on a second, you're creating a version of the past that has no actual people in it. Where were the ideas, the beliefs, the symbols that make us human? In this purely scientific view, a pot was just a tool for holding water, not a canvas for expressing who you are. As one of the key figures we'll talk about, Ian Hodder, put it, there was a feeling that the movement had gone too far in a kind of mad evangelical frenzy for scientific laws, and it was leaving the rich, messy, meaningful parts of human culture behind. Okay, so the stage is set for a showdown. You've got this group of young, super energetic scholars who are inspired by all these new ideas coming out of sociology and anthropology. They decide it's time for a major change. They all gathered in Cambridge, and their ideas were about to come together in one single explosive book. And this was the result. The book, which dropped in 1982, was called Symbolic and Structural Archaeology. And let me tell you, this wasn't just another academic book. This thing was a manifesto. It basically announced the arrival of a totally new way of thinking about the past, a movement that would soon be known as post-processualism. Yeah, this quote just nails the feeling at the time. This wasn't some minor tweak to the old ways. This was a full-on generational takeover. The challengers were here, and they weren't just poking holes in the old guard's theories. They were proposing a radical, exciting new vision for what archaeology could even be. So what was their big idea, their core argument? It was this. Objects, pots, tools, houses, you name it, they aren't just passive reflections of what people did. No way. Instead, objects are active. They are woven into social strategies, into power dynamics, into how people create meaning for themselves. Culture isn't just a survival kit. It's this complex web of symbols that people use to make sense of their world and live in it. And you can see just how deep this divide was. Where the old guard saw hard science explaining systems, the challengers saw an historical discipline interpreting meaning. Where one saw culture as a functional tool, the other saw it as a symbolic web. This wasn't just a small disagreement, you guys. These were two completely different ways of seeing the entire human past. Now, I know this all might sound a little abstract, but the book was packed with real-world examples. Take Danny Miller's work. He showed how pottery styles weren't just about looking pretty. They were part of a social game where elites would create new styles to show off their status, and other people would copy them to try and catch up or challenge them. The pots were literally acting back. Or Henrietta Moore, who studied refuse and found that what people threw away and where they threw it was part of a complicated social strategy between men and women. Even burials weren't always telling the truth. They could be used to hide or even lie about social inequalities. So, okay. The revolution happens, the book is out, the debate is raging, and the field of archaeology is changed forever. But what happened next? what was the long-term fallout from this huge intellectual war? Fast forward a full generation. We're talking 25 years later, and the ideas in that book had gone from being radical and revolutionary to basically mainstream. As one reviewer put it, the challenger has become the establishment. The revolution had, in a lot of ways, worked. And one of the biggest, most powerful legacies was this brand new sense of social responsibility. Mark Leone, who was one of the contributors to the original book, makes this great point. Once you say, hey, we're interpreting meaning here, you also have to admit that your interpretation has a real impact on people today. And this idea led to a huge boom in public archaeology, opening up dig sites, labs, and the whole discovery process to everyone. And the impact was absolutely huge. Suddenly, you've got the door blown wide open for entirely new fields, like feminist and gender archaeology, which started asking questions the old guard had never even thought to ask. Archaeologists started studying brand new topics like the body, memory, and landscape as social ideas. And crucially, it helped create a new ethic of actually talking to and working with the communities whose ancestors were being studied. But, like a lot of revolutions, the victory wasn't exactly clean. The intense conflict of the theory wars left some real scars on the discipline, what Ian Hodder himself calls a negative residue. One of the biggest problems? Fragmentation. Instead of creating some new, unified field, the battle lines just got deeper. You ended up with these hostile camps that pretty much refused to talk to each other. Hodder even points to the creation of a whole separate field of cognitive archaeology as a sad casualty of this split, arguing that, studying the mind should never have been separated from studying society in the first place. And then, oh boy, there was the biggest philosophical punch you could throw. Critics, like the famous archaeologist Colin Renfrew, argued that by ditching that strict scientific framework, post-processualism slid into relativism. If every interpretation is just a story we tell, then how do we judge which stories are better or more accurate? Without a common set of rules for testing ideas against the evidence, you risk becoming a field where, well, anything goes. So, where does all this leave us? Because look, this wasn't just some nerdy squabble in an ivory tower. This whole debate gets right to the very heart of why we even bother studying the past at all. What this whole theory war really pulled the curtain back on is that the past isn't something we just find, it's something we actively make in the present. The questions we ask, the theories we use, the meanings we're looking for, all of that shapes the story we tell about where we came from, and by extension, who we think we are today. In that story, it has incredibly real consequences. The way we interpret a site can impact the rights and heritage of living communities today. It shapes what millions of people see when they walk through a museum. It can even influence public policy. The past is always political, whether we like it or not. But there is a hopeful note to end on. After decades of fighting, Ian Hodder, the guy right at the center of this whole revolution, hopes the field is finally ready for what he calls a synthesis. A new approach that can combine the scientific rigor of the old guard with that deep focus on meaning and context from the challengers, basically taking the best of both worlds. And that leaves all of us with one last really big question to chew on. This great theory war taught us that every generation really does rewrite the past in its own image. So it kind of forces us to look in the mirror and ask, what are our biases today? What are our blind spots? What story of the human journey are we telling ourselves right here, right now?